When the Vietnam War was going on, I was in college and felt very patriotic about supporting our nation and wanted to be a fighter pilot. So I volunteered to go in the Air Force. My brother had preceded me, and my younger brother, and I got accepted and went to pilot training on Williams Air Force Base in Arizona. And my brother was there as an instructor, having just returned from the Vietnam War as a forward air controller. So I wanted a fighter, but I was like fifth in my class, so there was only one fighter, so I got a forward air control spot in an O2 aircraft instead, like my brother had had, and went off to Vietnam. And of course, we arrived in October, November of '70, and the Vietnamese had been at war for a long time since before that. And I found the war in Vietnam to be very regulated, and if we went below like 1,500 feet and got a bullet in the airplane, we were in danger of losing our wings. So I got very disgruntled with the rules and regulations and volunteered for a special program, special ops program, that supposedly where you could fly and fight as much as you wanted. And there weren't the rules and regulations. Didn't know where it was, didn't know anything more about it than that, but I volunteered and found out, gave up all my military clothing, IDs, and ended up in Laos, at Vientiane, the capital, and the embassy, and given a cover story of being told if I was shot down that I was a forest ranger, given a Laotian driver's license and embassy card, and that's all we had. So that's how I ended up in Laos. Okay, so the reason we gave up the uniforms and everything to go into Laos was that Laos was a neutral country from the Geneva Convention in 1954. And in fact, we were under the ambassador. Ambassador Godley was our commander-in-chief, if you will, at that time. So all the operations were under him. We were not under the Air Force and the military at all, even though my paycheck still came from the Department of Defense. But we were under the control of the embassy, the State Department, and the ambassador. Initially, I didn't know where I was going to go, but they assigned me to replace Lloyd Duncan, an Air Force Academy graduate that had his leg almost shot off in Pakse, Laos. So I replaced him at Pakse, which is down at the southern part of Laos near the Bolaven Plateau. And there were 5 of us, I believe, down there, and Dick Defer was the head guy, and he's the one that checked me out. And most of the operations were done up on the Ho Chi Minh Trail, of course, ran through Laos, and that's why we were there, interdicting the supply chain going into South Vietnam through Laos. And the main area that I operated on was at the top of the Bolaven Plateau, and that became my specialty. So a typical day of flying, we had our own airplane, and we had our own backseater, a Laotian that was an interpreter and ostensibly a clearing authority. And we would take off early in the morning and fly up. I usually went up to the top of the Bolaven Plateau and looked at the roads that were leading up onto the plateau to see if there was any fresh activity. You could actually pick out truck tracks or tank tracks and follow them, and usually you could find where they were trying to hide underneath the trees or the cover. So that was what I usually tried to do. And then, of course, as soon as you found some supplies, some armament or whatever, we'd call in to the command control center and ask for some fighters if they were available. That would be the U.S. Air. If they weren't available, then there was usually some T-28s flown by the Laotians that were available. And those guys were just amazing. They, you know, they've been flying for thousands of hours. They were deadly accurate. So what we have is, you know, they were a bicycle technology is when we went over there, and yet teach these guys to fly an airplane, and they were just awesome pilots. So we'd put in some airstrikes on that when, you know, the hour and a half, 2 hours were up and you're running out of fuel. We'd head back to Pakse, refuel, and take off again. And we could do like 3 or 4 missions in a day. We had no control over the number of hours we flew, as opposed to Vietnam. So we could do, 130, 140 hours in 1 month if we wanted. So I'd typically do 3 or 4 missions a day up onto the Bolevens and dropping bombs against munition stashes or armament. I never really had much fired back at me, though Dick Defer, the guy I mentioned that was my boss, he took a big round in the wing of his airplane, almost blew the wing off, and had to fight that all the way back to Pakse and land, but he made it. And so those were typical missions. The top of the Bolaven Plateau had a town that I'm not remembering the name of, but the Pathet Lao, the North Vietnamese, had taken control of that town, and Jim Lewis was a CIA Air America friend of mine that was, he started out as a Green Beret in Vietnam, and then went over here and into Laos, where he was a battalion commander. He was in command of a battalion of Thais that were fighting in the Vietnam War, which a lot of people don't know about. And there was this one day when we took back control of Pakse. Pakse was the name of the town on top. And so after we took control of it, I landed my bird dog on the road outside of town, and Jim and I walked through the town and took a tour of what we'd captured. So leaving there was sporting, taking off on that dirt road. Shouldn't have done it, but an interesting sidelight was as soon as I landed, there was an Air America helicopter landed right behind me, and to see if I was in trouble, had been shut down, lost the power or whatever, but he was right there. He says, any problems with the Raven? I said, no, just taking a tour. So that was a typical mission, but it was either that time or the one after that where coming back, I'm low on fuel and trying to make it back to the base, and the engine quit. And I thought, oh boy, I'm going to be landing out here somewhere, but I got the nose down and the fuel started up again, and I made it back to base.
How about your
Of course, the other four Raven facts there, but there were a number of Air America CIA guys also. Didn't meet with them too much, knew them. Jim Lewis, though, this battalion commander I talked about, he was my buddy, and we did a lot together, usually going to the bars and drinking Heinekens in the evening. So, yeah, but the became very close bonded with the Backseater that we had. The one that I flew with was the one that saved Lloyd Duncan's life. He pulled him from the airplane when his leg was badly mangled, and put a tourniquet on him and saved his life, basically. So. Ponte was the name of my Backseater, and he was a great guy. Whenever we wanted to fly, he was ready. But it was, if the fighting got real intense and there were a lot of bullets flying or whatever, the one saying was, "Raven, we go home now. Time to go home." We couldn't tell anybody where we were, and so my family didn't know I was over there. There were a few leaks in the press, including, not so much a leak, a denial. Nixon and Kissinger both swore on the TV interviews that before Congress that we had no military in Laos. Well, yeah, we weren't in uniform, but like I said, we were still paid by the Department of Defense, and we're doing the same mission in Laos. So my family didn't know where I was. They thought I was still in Vietnam. So I don't know. I don't know how the mail went. I don't even remember writing much. I'm sure I wrote to my parents, but I didn't. I just certainly didn't tell them where I went. I would think that all our embassy, we were supplied by an embassy run out of the embassy, and so I'll get to that in a minute, but the correspondence would have went up to Vientiane, to the State Department, and then to the States from there. So we knew enough not to put any information in it. Now, a sidelight to the embassy run is that Frank Cricker and I like to drink gin, so we had each of us a case of gin was our supplies for the month, and the other guys like beer, so they had a pallet of beer flown in. So we'd keep our gin in the freezing compartment of the refrigerator and come back from a flight and just pour that syrupy liquid out and savor our successful missions that day. The southern area was not as active as Long Chien and where the northern guys were, but two specific incidents come to mind that were interesting to me. One was that time when we took back Pakse and I toured the village with Jim Lewis. His call sign was Sword in the book. But the other would be, there was a small town, and we didn't like to bomb villages, obviously temples, but villages even. But they had built up such a large cache of ammunition in one corner of one village that they insisted that I direct bombs against that side of the village. My backseater, Ponte, was in constant contact with the tribal chieftain on the ground, and he directed where we were to drop the bombs. And in the footage I have from that event, you can see the big billows of smoke coming up from those munitions being destroyed. You know, I hated to wipe out that part of the village, but he insisted that we do so. So that was the only time I took a bullet hole in my airplane, was dueling with the guy on the ground that was around that munition piles. I was firing my AR-15 out the side of the cockpit, and he was firing up at us, and one of the bullets went through the airplane. So not my body, but luckily. The main reason we were over there, like I said before, was to interdict the supply chain running through Laos. And on the ground, the CIA had made arrangements with the Hmong and the other Laotians to fight in this secret war. And of course, up north, General Vang Pao was the main leader of that group. And he and his group of Laotians basically held back several battalions of North Vietnamese and Pathet Lao and kept them occupied. So they did a great service for our nation, bore a lot of casualties then and after the war. When the war was settled, or if you will, or declared over, May 15th, 1975, they yanked Vang Pao and a few of his fellow officers out of Laos, but they left behind thousands and thousands of these fighters and their families in Laos. A lot of them that I know went into internment camps in Thailand after they finally got across the Mekong River into Thailand. And they spent 5 or 6 years in these internment camps being re-educated, or just, it wasn't so much re-educated in Thailand, it was just a holding place for them until they could finally arrange with family to get over into to America. And that's why a lot of them came here to Fresno or to Sacramento. A big group went into Michigan, and a big group of them went into Denver, Colorado. I was very supportive of the nation and doing my bit for the nation and the country. And you know, we hear a lot about World War II vets and the greatest generation, and I kind of chuckle at that because they had the whole nation behind them at that time. And yet, when I went off to war, my brother went off to war, we had a nation that didn't support the war. We had our fellow companions who, a lot of them ran off to Canada or resisted going to fight. And so it was a totally different generation. Now, when I came back, you know, I never got sped on, but I certainly was looked askance at and treated badly for having been in the war. But you know, and interestingly, you know, my attitude about the war changed after further study and research into the history. And I think the nation we should have supported, which is the one I did support, was Laos, and we shouldn't have supported the South Vietnamese against the North. The North and South should have settled their own troubles. But I did love the Vietnamese and the Thais and the Laotians. When I got there in '70, the Vietnamese had been through a lot, and so I didn't really I didn't gain much respect for the fighting capability of the Vietnamese. And my friends now ask me if I'd like to go back to Vietnam. I say no, but I'd really like to go back to Laos or to Thailand. And I have been back to Thailand. I went to Bangkok 3 years ago to the Rotary Convention in Bangkok. So when I left in, so that would have been approaching, well, let's talk about how I left. So I had made arrangements. We had blanket TDY orders to go anywhere we wanted in Southeast Asia in civilian clothes. Well, I used the opportunity to go over to Tokyo and buy a motorcycle and have it, the frame chopped and mailed into to Ubon, Thailand, which is across the river from Pakse. And when it arrived, I flew over in one of our U-17s, a bigger airplane than we normally use, and ferried it back over to Pakse and had an Air America mechanic weld it to the frame together. And I had a Yamaha 250 Enduro in Laos, one of the biggest motorcycles that we'd run around on. And Frank Cricker, who replaced Dick DeFur as my boss after Dick went up north and got killed, Frank and I would take the motorcycles with machine guns over our shoulders and go out in the countryside and drive around and look around, and we were idiots. We shouldn't have done that. But anyway, on one of the nights when I'd been out late drinking with Jim Lewis, I was heading back to the Hooch at night, and one of our other fellow Ravens in a Jeep decided to race me to the Hooch. Well, we were neck and neck when he swerved to miss a chuck hole and slapped me into a chain link fence, and I broke fingers in both hands holding onto the handlebars. And they took me by a Pilatus Porter to the CIA hospital on the Mekong River there and bandaged me up, said, oh, it's just sprains, you'll be fine. Well, they weren't healing because they were broken. And finally I had to go over to the hospital in Ubon, Thailand, and they said, your days are over, you're going back home. So that's how I came home to Mather to recuperate. I was supposed to get a assignment of choice, which would have been a fighter. But they sent me to Mather, where I was to be a pilot in the Navigator flying classroom, the T-28, T-29. And so, yeah, leaving, you were told not to tell what you had been doing, just to say you'd been in Vietnam. And it was several years later when enough of this leaked out and became public knowledge that we could talk about it. You know, I don't know if there's a lesson that I learned in the Secret War, except that there is always special operations going on, and you need to look and examine deeply to find out exactly what we're doing. In hindsight, I wish I'd have done more research into the actual situation in Laos or in the Vietnam War, but I was still supported my nation and went off to do the best I could.